Trump vacationing at his Mar-a-Lago resort, filling out his administration today with a name from the Bush administration's national security team. MSNBC's Casey Hunt joining us to talk all things Trump transition. They would push back on the idea of vacationing. Suffice to say, not a very public schedule, at least today. Nonetheless, it is a working holiday, as they insist. Tell us about this new pick, Tom Bossert. One of the big biographical details about him, particularly considering recent headlines, is his work in cybersecurity. He's going to be an assistant to the president for Homeland Security and counterterrorism.
That's right, Peter. And he has had this focus on cybersecurity during his work in the private sector. And he is now saying in a statement from the Trump team that that's an area where he wants to focus, that he wants to draw private companies farther in to working with the government as the country tries to tackle cybersecurity challenges. That's actually something that both Democrats and Republicans have argued for. Hillary Clinton argued for it on the campaign trail when she was running as well. But as you mentioned, if there's something here that's controversial, it's probably his work with the Bush administration and his support for the war in Iraq, which, of course, runs contrary to what Donald Trump certainly said during the campaign, not necessarily contrary to what he said when the war was actually being waged during the Bush administration. But that's a focus there. It's important to note that this is not a position that will have to be confirmed by the Senate. It's similar to the National Security Advisor position, Michael Flynn, in that regard. This is somebody who Trump gets to choose to serve at his pleasure and that he doesn't need Senate confirmation for.
A role that's now held by a woman by the name of Lisa Monaco for this president. What else are we expecting transition-wise from Donald Trump in the coming days and weeks? He still has some critical seats within his own cabinet to fill out.
He does, Peter, although I think that the focus is starting to shift towards the defense for a lot of these potentially more controversial picks that are going to have to wind their way through Capitol Hill. Since most of the major choices have been made, now they're trying to make sure that Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, for example, Steve Mnuchin for Treasury in particular, can get through the confirmation hearings in a relatively smooth fashion. They're putting together something of a war room team that's going to make sure that these hearings go smoothly. Some of them will start before Donald Trump's inauguration. For example, we're expecting Jeff Sessions' first hearing to be on January 10th. So at this point, there's not a lot that Democrats can do, really, to hold up some of these picks. They might pick one or two to, make more of a push against, if you will. But they're not really able to filibuster them. It's very rare, even if they did still have the power to do that, that would ever happen. But at the same time, there's a ton of material that goes into this. One newspaper reporting this morning that Steve Ratner, when he took a position in the Treasury Department under the Obama administration, spent $400,000 of his own money just getting his financial house in order, because he has, of course, millions of dollars. And many of these Trump nominees are going to be facing similar types of hurdles because a lot of them, as we know, are billionaires.
And Casey, right on cue, as we're having this conversation, as if Donald Trump himself is watching, he just put out some new information announcing a man by the name of Jason Greenblatt will be the special representative for international negotiations. Jason Greenblatt is the chief legal officer of the Trump organization right now. He'll be joining the team for the new administration as well. And that just leads me to a separate topic, though, but another Trump ally, Carl Palladino, who made some comments about the First Lady, among others, that really caused a big stir, viewed as not just insensitive, but even racist. He's apologizing in a way right now. What are we hearing from him?
Yeah, Peter, this a top ally of the of Donald Trump's campaign in New York, the honorary co-chair of his campaign in the state, and somebody who met with Donald Trump as this transition was getting off the ground in early December. And he, as you note, had some offensive things to say, both about the First Lady of the United States as well as President Obama, now saying that he is apologizing to minorities that he might have offended. Part of this, though, is, of course, he does have a seat on the school board in Buffalo, New York, and there's now some discussion about whether or not he should be allowed to keep that seat. So there may be some back and forth going on over that issue. But at this point, obviously, those comments made just before Christmas continuing to get a lot of negative attention for him. He, of course, ran for governor, was the Republican nominee for governor, ran against Andrew Cuomo and lost the election. Peter.
Widely panned as outrageous, those comments before. Casey Hunt helping us out right now. Casey, thank you for the latest on the president-elect and his potential conflicts of interest. We want to get to our panel if we can right now. Sabrina Siddiqui is here, political reporter for The Guardian. She's and also congressional reporter for The Hill. Mike Lillis is joining us, as you can see on the right side of your screen. Sabrina, to you first. The Washington Post with a big breakout, a profile today of Donald Trump and his ties to China. We're going to put up on some of the screen some of their findings. They write, quote, Trump Hotels has made confident predictions this year about opening 20 or 30 luxury hotels in China. Also, the state-owned Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is among the largest office tenants in Trump Tower. They go on to say the deal there has been worth more than like $1.5 million annually, that expires in 2018. That's from Bloomberg News. The bottom line is this is a real challenge for Donald Trump, even at this point, and we'll be talking about it as we tick off every country that he has relationships right now. So how does this White House handle that sense from critics that his hardball tactics, in this case with China, don't somehow betray a financial motive that he may personally have as well?
Well, I think this is going to continue and be a theme of Donald Trump's presidency. This isn't the first time we see him mixing business and politics. When we're on the subject of China, for example, he incensed Beijing by accepting a congratulatory call from the president of Taiwan a few weeks ago. Of course, we learned after the fact that a representative from the Trump organization had made a business trip to Taiwan in October, talked about a real estate development project there. So when it comes to China, this is one of the most complex foreign policy relationships that the United States has. And I think the more we learn about Donald Trump wanting to further his business interests in the region, the more it runs counter to, first of all, the tough talk that was a core pillar of his campaign, portraying China as a country that lies, cheats, and steals from the United States, and also I think calls into question every move he now makes with respect to his approach toward Beijing. Every move that he makes is going to be seen through the prism, potentially, of his business interests in China.
And Mike, to you, this profile comes after Trump laid into critics regarding his foundation, which he said in recent days that he's going to shut down, saying, quote, I gave millions of dollars to the foundation, raised or received millions more, all of which is given to charity, and the media won't report it. The Post reports that since its inception, Trump's actually given the foundation more than $5 million. But since 2008, they say he's given nothing, that other donors have given just over $9 million. The New York Attorney General, as we've been reporting, says that Donald Trump can't close the foundation until its investigation is done. So where does this, and perhaps how does this end? Will it ever sufficiently satisfy his critics? Can you separate not just the foundation, but the Trump brand from all those conflicts of interest?
Right, and it's a good question. There's a lot of moving parts there. And, it's an unusual foundation in the sense that, as you mentioned, he hasn't given any money between 2009 and 2014. He hadn't given anything. He was relying on outside donors, wealthy donors from the outside. In that tweet, he said, all the money's going to charity. No overhead, everything's going to charity. But as the Washington Post has reported over the past year, that wasn't quite the case. There were, a lot of dubious expenses there, including portraits of himself that cost tens of thousands of dollars. Exactly. He was giving campaign donations to a Florida Attorney General. So, as you mentioned, the New York Attorney General is looking into it. He is not allowed to close the foundation until that investigation is over. But you can see him playing defense as he is prone to do, by playing offense and attacking the media. And that will last, I think, until the New York Attorney General is done with this probe.
And Sabrina, President Obama, if you're flipping around, you would have noticed one of his most recent headlines in a conversation with his former close advisor, David Axelrod, basically said that had he been running, he would have beaten Donald Trump. What role do we see President Obama? Some will ask, why did President Obama weigh in like this right now? What role do we think he will play in a Trump administration, as it were? Will he be the most vocal critic pushing back along the way? How do you think the White House, which you know well, how do you think they view his responsibilities and his role going forward?
Well, I think he'll continue to be a critic. I think his comments stemmed in part from wanting to be involved in rebuilding the Democratic Party. I think the election of Donald Trump, if anything, has pulled him back into the political spectrum more than he would have anticipated. Also, an implicit criticism
of Hillary Clinton in there as well.
Indeed. I think that he's trying to make the case that the party has failed to sell its economic message and has somehow alienated these working class voters, especially working class white voters, who did cast their ballots for Obama both in 2008 and 2012, and then shifted away from Hillary Clinton toward Donald Trump in this particular cycle. So I think some of that framing that he made, looking at his approval ratings, looking at the way that he has turned around the economy, had to do with pushing Democrats to find a way to harness the economic agenda that is at the core of their message, and to do a better job, not just in the next presidential cycle, but also in midterms, also down ballot, because we know one of the areas they've suffered most is in these down ballot ballot races under President Obama's tenure.
Well, and after shedding so much support in that white working class communities in a lot of places that President Obama had done well in the past, Pennsylvania, Ohio, other places in that region as well. Mike, to you, if I can, one of the topics, of course, is the inauguration now barely 3 weeks away, and NBC News has confirmed that senior advisor Stephen Miller is going to be writing Donald Trump's speech. Miller, for those like myself and others who followed Trump on the campaign, he wrote a lot of the scripted speeches through the campaign season, among them that convention speech that a lot of people panned as simply a dark vision for America. What do we expect from this speech? Advisors are saying it's going to be about unifying America. How big a task, how big a challenge is that for Trump?
Well, he's got an enormous challenge. I mean, this is going to be a very, very animated inauguration, as you can guess. I mean, you know, there's going to be thousands of protesters. There's going to be thousands of Trump supporters. We haven't seen an estimate about how many people are going to be there, but it's going to be quite a raucous event. And so, in the face of all of that, he's got to come up with some kind of message that's going to bring people together. You know, President Obama had his big spiel about hope. Donald Trump is of course, thinks that didn't work at all. But to unify the country, he's got to do something. And this is day one. This will be his first big test. Stephen Miller, of course, is well known on Capitol Hill. He was Jeff Sessions' press secretary for many years, and so the reporters all know him very well. But he isn't known for being very divisive. Jeff Sessions is known for being divisive on things like immigration reform. And so we'll have to see how if he can shift into this other mode, because he's a very good attack dog. We're less sure if he's a good unifier. So
well, Donald Trump,
we'll see on January 20th.
To at least half the country, Donald Trump is the hope and change candidate, whether he can bring the others on board as well. Sabrina and Mike, both of you, thank you very much. Up next here on MSNBC, War of Words, the bitter battle